Lots of people talk like they know the Bible front to back, but based on these widespread common misconceptions, we have doubts.
Even though a major world religion centers on him, there's surprisingly little direct evidence that clues us into what Jesus really looked like. And if you happen to abide by the classic images of Jesus, that is, classic as defined by centuries of European-influenced art making, then chances are your internal image of Jesus is all wrong. According to history, the biblical evidence about Jesus' appearance is practically non-existent. We know that he would have been around 30 years old when he started making waves as a religious leader. It's also pretty reasonable to conclude that he was a normal-looking guy for the time, so standard issue that Judas Iscariot had to point him out when it came time for Jesus' arrest.
Arrest him.
It doesn't help that Western art has changed its depiction of Jesus many times over the years, often depending more on cultural trends and personal preferences of the artist than documented fact. That said, we can make some reasonable conclusions about his appearance, extrapolating from common traits seen around the region at the time. In the book, What Did Jesus Look Like?, academic Joan E. Taylor advances an educated guess that Jesus likely had curly hair, dark eyes, and brown skin, much like other people in his community. It is often presumed that Jesus began his life as a humble carpenter, working with his hands in obscurity before he became a major religious figure. However, the use of the word carpenter isn't quite right here. There are really only two verses, Mark 6:3 and Matthew 13:55, that even bother to reference Jesus' occupation or that of Joseph. It seemingly wasn't that important to the writers of the Gospels. And when that occupation is mentioned in the original Greek text of the early Gospels, the word tekton is used, according to the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. As Architectural Histories reports, the job description of a tekton can include plenty of woodworking, but it doesn't necessarily mean carpenter. Rather, a tekton has been defined in any number of ways, with jobs that can encompass carpentry work, but is more tied to the work of a general builder. It may be more accurate to think of Jesus and Joseph as general contractors working in Nazareth. It appears that we got to carpenter because when English translations of the Bible started to debut, there was already an established tradition of referring to Jesus as a carpenter, despite the lack of clear biblical evidence. So many Christians celebrate the birth of Christ every year on December 25th, but what if he wasn't born on that date? If you traveled back in time to the first few centuries after Jesus' death, you'd be hard-pressed to find any celebration of his birth, much less one taking place around that time of the year. According to history, the oldest known record of a Christmas-like celebration is an observation of the Nativity that took place in Rome in 336 AD. Before that, no one claimed to know at what time of year Jesus had been born, nor did it seem to concern them very much. Easter, which commemorates Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, was considered far more central to the Christian celebratory calendar. Later, theologians would contend that God had created the world on the spring equinox, implying that Jesus was probably conceived around the same time of the year, the lack of biblical support notwithstanding. There's no directly stated reason why early church leaders picked December 25th as the holiday, but it's worth noting that the Feast of the Annunciation is March 25th. That's the day Catholics celebrate Mary becoming pregnant. Add 9 months to that and you get December 25th. Another commonly reported fact is that Christmas lines up with pagan festivals like the Roman Saturnalia, which themselves tend to occur around the winter solstice. Saturnalia actually ended on the 23rd, so the dates don't really line up, but it's still commonly thought that Christmas is on the 25th because of a pagan holiday. It's not. We don't really know specifically why Christmas is celebrated on December 25th. History reports that scholars commonly agree there was a real historical Jesus. However, the complicated truth is that direct evidence for his existence is frustratingly hard to come across. So while we can be reasonably certain that there was once a religious leader named Jesus who lived in what is now Israel around the 1st century, things after that point get murky pretty quickly. First, there's no officially verified archaeological evidence for Jesus, meaning that no one has yet found any tangible things that are without a doubt connected to the man. Yes, this means that even long-venerated religious relics like the supposed crown of thorns traditionally housed in Notre Dame Cathedral or bits of the so-called true cross displayed elsewhere are unconfirmed as relics associated with Jesus. But what about documentary evidence? That avenue has proven more useful, though not exactly fruitful. Some non-biblical writers did confirm a few spare details of Jesus' life. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian living in the 1st century, offers up one of the earliest such accounts. In his Jewish Antiquities, he writes of a man named James who was unfairly executed, mentioning that the victim is the brother of, quote, Jesus who is called Messiah. yet a longer account may have been doctored by later Christian editors. Another brief mention comes in the Annals of Imperial Rome, where historian Tacitus refers to a man who, by the 2nd century, was called Christos. Quite a few depictions of Jesus over the centuries have shown him with long hair. Perhaps a bunch of artists have just found that image more exciting than showing him with short hair. And as it turns out, the long hair of Jesus in so many depictions may not have anything to do with historical fact. According to the BBC, having a big old beard and long hair was traditionally the mark of a Greek or Roman god, such as Zeus. Everyday men at the time would have been far more likely to have short hair. In fact, the earliest known images of Jesus from the 3rd century show him in just such a manner. A beard might not have been totally out of the question, though. If Jesus were busy traveling for his preaching, he may not have had time to visit a barber and could have developed something of a beard. But long hair would have certainly marked him out as a member of a group known as the Nazarites. Yet, because no one ever claimed Jesus was a Nazarite and because he drank wine, another no-no for Nazarites, we can make a reasonable conclusion that he had short hair and, at most, a short beard like everyone else. Jesus was, by many modern accounts and retellings of his story, a generally loving guy who preached peace and togetherness during his time on earth. On its face, that can't be totally disputed, as there are plenty of Bible verses where Jesus tells people to love one another. According to Christianity.com, he's also commonly known in Christian circles as the Prince of Peace. But it would be a mistake to assume that Jesus was a meek, thoroughly chill dude who gave out blanket kindness. In fact, as Got Questions relates, there are plenty of biblical verses that reveal far more nuance in his emotions. There's the incident where he overturned some tables and upset moneylenders working in Jerusalem's temple, a story so striking that it's mentioned in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, says the Lord. But you have made it a den of thieves.
He was also known to get frustrated at people who weren't meeting him halfway with his teachings, as when the Pharisee fundamentalist wouldn't answer his questions in Mark 3:1-5. According to Got Questions, Jesus' anger wasn't a bad thing. No Bible verses really indicate that his emotions ever tipped over into uncontrolled rage, though the moneylenders may have argued otherwise at the time. Neither is there any textual evidence that Jesus stewed over his anger and allowed it to become a grudge. For many believing Christians, while this may be a surprising point of Jesus' actions and personality, his anger appears righteous. Though it's the name many of us know him by today, the 1st century Jewish religious leader and prophet who is now called Jesus would never have heard that name applied to him during his lifetime. According to PBS's Origin of Everything, his original Hebrew name was actually Yeshua. If we were to translate that to a more modern form, the originator of Christianity would more accurately have gone by the name Joshua. So how did we get to Jesus? It's all due to the Greek language employed in the New Testament. His name went from Yeshua to Jesus, mainly because Greek just didn't have the same characters to handle the sound of the original Hebrew. Jesus, which rather easily became Jesus down the line, was their best approximation. As Slate reports, Yeshua would have faced the same problem borne by modern kids with popular names. A bunch of people in the region apparently were named Yeshua. It certainly pops up often in the Hebrew Bible, though those individuals often become Joshua in later translations. Furthermore, just from the time of Jesus' crucifixion, excavators have uncovered over 70 tombs bearing that name. Not only does that make it incredibly hard to find archaeological evidence of Jesus' tomb, which would be an absolutely groundbreaking discovery for biblical scholars, but it also underlies just how common and unremarkable Jesus may have seemed upon first glance. Given how many stories there are of Jesus' life, including those in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'd think we'd have some confirmed contemporary reports of his comings and goings. But we really don't. We've got some accounts written within a few generations or so of Jesus' time, just like that of Josephus. When it comes to eyewitness accounts from people who actually met the man, things get pretty shaky. Speaking to NPR, religion professor Bart D. Ehrman notes that we can't be so sure that the Gospels were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Instead, it's quite possible that later writers simply attached the names of the apostles to their work. If they were actually written by the people in question, then why are there so many significant differences between the details of the Gospels, like whether or not Jesus was divine? Perhaps most significantly, there's no language in any of the Gospels that clearly indicates the writer was there as a witness. The faithful may argue against this idea, but looking at things strictly in reference to the books in the New Testament, there's no confirmed proof that the apostles or anyone else who was part of Jesus' inner circle ever wrote down their accounts. Contrary to some modern folks' expectations, there was practically no way Jesus would have thought of himself as a Christian. First of all, as the BBC reports, the Christ part of Jesus Christ was not an actual feature of his name. It actually is a Greek word related to the Hebrew term for Messiah, and is effectively translated as Anointed One. That title really caught on after Jesus' death, according to Britannica. Moreover, PBS's Frontline contends that Jesus would have been very likely to see himself as a Jewish person. He was born in a Jewish community to a Jewish family and would have been intimately familiar with the various laws and practices of Judaism in the first century. As Professor Shay J.D. Cohen argues, even the Gospels tactically assume that Jesus was Jewish, with nary a mention of him starting a new religious movement, much less one that would be called Christianity. For Jesus and everyone around him, it's far more certain that he was seen as someone with a unique connection to God, but not as an individual in the process of breaking away from established Jewish tradition. It's only after that religious movement grew from a Jewish sect into independent Christianity over the following centuries that anyone would think of him as something more. The Bible continues to be an influential and controversial text, so it's no surprise there are common misconceptions of its material. Today, the Bible is seen as one book, but according to the BBC, the Bible is a multilingual library spanning 1,000 years and 3 languages. The Old Testament dates to around 1000 BC and is mostly in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites. The last 7 books, the infamous Deuterocanonical books, however, still exist in Greek. The 4th century BC Jewish elites adopted Greek to interact with the rest of the Hellenistic world. This led to the translation of Jewish text into Greek. The New Testament was also written in Greek in order to reach the wider non-Jewish audience that did not speak Hebrew. Alongside the well-known languages of Hebrew and Greek is Aramaic. Surviving today among the Middle East Christian minority, Aramaic was once the Middle East's primary language. From this web of languages and traditions, a single volume was eventually created, but perhaps surprisingly, it happened well after Christianity took root in the Mediterranean. The Protestant practice of sola scriptura sees the Bible as the only correct source of God's teaching. In reality, the Bible, as is understood today, did not exist when Jesus lived among his disciples, nor soon after his crucifixion. The march toward a common canon was littered with problems. After Jesus' death and resurrection, many Gospels circulated in the Eastern Mediterranean and especially in Egypt. These Coptic language texts, called Gnostic Gospels, promoted the idea of hidden knowledge rather than obedience to a deity. Mennonite scholar David Ewart noted that there also existed other books cited in the Bible that some Christian communities considered scripture. At the end of the 4th century AD, 2 church councils sought to end the confusion by standardizing what is today known as the Bible. In 393 AD, the Synod of Hippo achieved what previous councils had not. It agreed upon an Old Testament standard of 46 books. The Synod of Carthage 4 years later set the New Testament canon at 27 books. Gnostic texts such as the Gospel of Thomas were rejected due to what was considered heretical material, like Jesus killing childhood friends, questionable origins, or other inconsistencies. The final result was a 73-book volume, but it would not be the last time it received a major edit. Catholics and Protestants do not see eye to eye on many issues. One would think, though, that they would agree on the number of scriptures. Not exactly. A case for frequent misunderstanding on both sides, Catholics and Protestants actually use different Bibles. That's thanks to Martin Luther's innovations in the early 16th century. The National Catholic Register argues that Luther removed the Deuterocanonical books from the Bible because he believed they weren't what God really wanted. Nathan Busenitz of the Master's Seminary rejects accusations that Luther modified the Bible or removed important texts. Luther conformed his Old Testament to the Jewish Hebrew Bible, which does not contain the 7 Deuterocanonical books. His opinion was that if Jesus, a Jew, affirmed only 39 Old Testament books, then the others were not scripture. Nevertheless, Protestant Bibles often include the Deuterocanonical books and appendices as worthy of a believer's attention, while ecumenical Bibles place them at the end of the Old Testament. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, solidified these texts' status as scripture at the Council of Trent in the 16th century, cementing today's differences. A popular misconception among both Christians and Messianic Jews is that only the New Testament is about Jesus because he does not appear in the Old. But significant groups within Christianity believe that the whole Bible is about Jesus. Scholars have pored over the Old Testament looking for him there. The conclusion? Jesus makes multiple cameo appearances in the Old Testament. They just hide behind English translations. The Jewish Voice notes that Jesus' Hebrew name, Yeshua, is translated as salvation some 150 times in the Old Testament. So the phrase, "the Lord is my salvation," can technically be read as "the Lord is my Yeshua," or Jesus. In a Christian worldview, this makes sense. Jesus is the savior of mankind, so his name should be a byword for salvation. Whether this counts as an appearance is debatable, but the name is definitely there. Jesus may also physically appear in the Old Testament, just not in human form. According to St. Justin the Martyr, the angel of the Lord in Genesis was likely an early appearance of Jesus. Walter Kaiser Jr. of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary even sees Jesus as the voice behind the burning bush that spoke to Moses. Unlike the appearance of Jesus' name, none of these are 100% agreed upon in any Christian denomination, but are interesting ideas nevertheless. The fifth commandment, or the sixth for Protestants, is mostly known as "Thou shalt not kill." In a nutshell, human life, made in God's image, is sacred, therefore killing must be forbidden, right?
An unbeliever! Persecute, kill the heretic!
According to Jewish magazine The Forward, the original Hebrew command is restricted to the killing of innocents. Matters such as self-defense, war, and capital punishment are governed by a different set of rules. That said, The Forward notes that even Jews have debated the commandment's meaning. So, Bible translators sometimes left the commandment purposely ambiguous. In a historical context, Catholics and many Protestants interpret the command as "Thou shalt not murder." From the Catholic perspective, the idea of a crusade, for instance, does not run counter to this commandment. This is because a crusade was conceived as a defense of Christendom against Islamic expansion. Readers of English Bibles will notice the appearances of the words Lord, Lord, and Lord in the Old Testament. This confuses even Christians, as noted by the Christian Courier, and does not seem to have a purpose. But it is actually an example of translations attempting to convey original Hebrew nuances that are lost in English. Written Lord, the word is one of God's titles. In Hebrew, it's Adonai. When written Lord, or Lord, it refers to God's name. So why not just write out the name of God? It seems easier than creating this confusing trifecta of uses with one word. The reason is found in Jewish tradition. Jews did not, and still don't, out of reverence, pronounce God's name, Yahweh, under any circumstances. However, the scriptures and prayers containing the name still have to be read or recited aloud. Therefore, Jewish scribes noted that Yahweh should be read aloud as Adonai. This workaround is preserved in Bible translations today. Christian Bible translators imitated the convention, translating Yahweh as Lord rather than writing out God's name, whose exact pronunciation is unknown. This neat but misunderstood distinction ties Christianity with its Jewish roots and explains one of the Bible's more mystifying conventions. The word Philistine originally referred to Israel's chief enemies in the Promised Land. Their name, according to Merriam-Webster, is a byword for uncouth, uncultured people. However, this view of the Philistines has its origins in 17th century Germany and is not biblical. The Philistines were actually quite civilized, as recent archaeological evidence attests. In 2016, a team of archaeologists working near the city of Ashkelon discovered a large Philistine cemetery dating to around 1000 BC. The site was hidden to prevent Haredi Jewish protests, but the team eventually released its findings, which were nothing short of spectacular. Among the finds were large storage jars, imported pottery, perfume, fragrant oils, and jewelry. The Smithsonian notes that the grave goods were strategically arranged for the benefit of the dead. The perfume was placed on the dead person's face near the nostrils so the tomb owner could smell the fragrance in the afterlife. The careful and reverent treatment of the dead, who were equipped with the most sumptuous and exotic goods of the era, debunks the idea of the Philistines as savages. Instead, it points to a civilized culture that had been inherited from the Great Bronze Age civilizations of Greece and Crete. The word Philistine in Arabic means Palestinian. As a result, political debates have attempted to connect the modern Palestinians with the Philistines. However, these debates lack historical context. They also obscure the Philistines' fascinating origins, which are found in the Bible. According to the Bible, the Philistines originated in Kaftor, which was probably Crete. They were a sea people from the Aegean. Genetic testing on the bodies in the Ashkelon cemetery supports this notion. The results show that the Philistines probably originated in southern Europe, such as Greece, Spain, and Sardinia. They then migrated somewhere between the end of the Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. The genetic studies suggest that the Philistines arrived after a sea migration. They were genetically very similar to their Levantine neighbors. However, they crucially also carried DNA from southern Europe and the Aegean. Most likely, these migrants had settled in the region and intermarried with local women. So potentially, the Philistines were actually heirs of the first Greek civilization, not the uncouth barbarians the Bible makes them out to be. Millions of American children are familiar with the classic underdog story of the shepherd boy David and the giant Goliath. David killed Goliath with a slingshot and became king of Israel. It seems too good to be true, especially since scientists and historians have generally rejected David's existence. But evidence from the Middle East suggests that even if he did not kill Goliath, he was a real person. The strongest evidence for David in the textual record comes from the Israelites' enemies. The Tel Dan Stela, belonging to the Hazael of Damascus, describes how he defeated a rival king of Judea of the house of David. Now, this stela is fragmentary, and the reading has been challenged, but it is not the only appearance of David's name. There is a second possible record of David's name, although it is admittedly less clear. According to Egyptologist Ken Kitchen, there is a possible mention of a place called the Heights of David and a list of place names engraved in the walls of the Egyptian temple of Karnak. This one is contested because one sign is too damaged to be read with full certainty. But in light of the mention of David in the Tel Dan Stela, King David seems less mythological.
More than a mythical figure, more than a person of great valor, he more resembles a mafia don.
A popular misconception regarding the two parts of the Bible is that the New Testament does away with the Old. This view primarily stems from the stark difference between Jesus' message of salvation and forgiveness on one hand and the Old Testament's Jewish law on the other. Now, Jewish law was harsh. The notorious Levitical laws prescribed the death penalty for a range of moral offenses, sometimes by burning or stoning the transgressors. The law also mandated reciprocal justice like eye for an eye for interpersonal crimes. So what does the Bible itself say about this controversy? Well, Jesus stated in no uncertain terms in Matthew 5:18 that not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, the New Testament clearly gives Jesus' approval to the content of the Old Testament. So why don't the old penalties apply? The Catholic Church explains that Jesus took upon himself all of the sins and suffered the penalty, which was death. So the penalties for violating the law were no longer needed because Jesus had already suffered them. The Immaculate Conception is largely misunderstood. Popular wisdom holds that since Jesus' mother was the Virgin Mary, his conception was immaculate and not the product of sexual relations. This is a near universal Christian belief, but it is not the Immaculate Conception. It is the Annunciation. The Immaculate Conception is an exclusively Catholic dogma concerning the Virgin Mary's conception. The phrase Immaculate Conception suggests that God shielded the Virgin Mary at her conception from original sin. Catholics believe that humans are born with sin inherited from Adam's disobedience to God in the Garden of Eden. Baptism washes it off, but Mary suffered from none of this. The Catholic reasoning is that Mary needed to be sinless in order to be Jesus' mother. Thus, not only did she never commit any sins in life, she could not have been born with any sin either. That would have negated her purity. Unlike the Annunciation, which does appear in the Bible, the Immaculate Conception does not. Instead, the dogma developed in Western Europe during the Middle Ages before being defined under Pope Pius IX in 1854. Protestants view the dogma as unbiblical papal overreach, while the Eastern Orthodox Church rejects the dogma as unnecessary. The well-known Christmas carol We Three Kings is a holiday favorite. Three kings from the East come to adore the infant Jesus and bring him gifts. But this famous phrase does not appear anywhere in the Bible and is completely absent from early Christian writings. If the three kings were not kings, then who or what were they? English Bibles call them wise men from the East, which in Jesus' time meant the Iranian world. In a nod to their Persian background, they are sometimes referred to as the Magi, which was the Persian word for a Zoroastrian priest. These astrologers had a keen interest in the Star of Bethlehem, while the Gospel of Matthew suggests that they were among Jesus' first believers. This story of the three kings draws heavily on inference. Because the Magi brought Jesus 3 gifts, it was inferred that there must have been 3 of them. However, some Syrian sources give numbers as high as 12, but inconsistencies of these sorts are expected from a story that draws so heavily on oral tradition. Which angels are the highest ranking in heaven? What exactly was Lucifer? And can angels have children? You'll be surprised by how many things people get wrong about angels. In popular imagination, angels are winged heavenly beings that protect people against evil. The term angel is actually a job description that explains what these heavenly beings do. The Greek term angelos is the root word for the English word angel, and it means messenger. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for angel has the same meaning. Hence, an angel is simply one of God's messengers. So, what does this job entail? Well, that depends on the angel's rank. There are 9 types of angels with different assigned roles in the angelic hierarchy. Some angels are close to God and look upon him in adoration. Others are tasked with supervising lower-ranking angels who serve as intermediaries between God and man. These angels are responsible for delivering God's orders directly to the recipients. According to Chabad, God, quote, pre-programmed his angels for specific purposes. For instance, the archangel Gabriel is explicitly a messenger, while Raphael's job is to heal. Their specific job descriptions lead to some interesting theology regarding what they can and cannot do. One would expect heavenly creatures endowed by God with divine powers to be able to do basic things that humans can do, but angels are limited in their powers and are incapable of simple things such as multitasking. This limitation is perhaps best illustrated in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 19, 3 angels of the Lord visit Abraham to inform him that his wife is pregnant. Sodom will be destroyed and he will be healed. One angel could theoretically have accomplished all 3 of these orders, yet for some reason God sends out one for each task. Jewish commentators suggest that the ability to only perform one task at a time is one of the defining characteristics that makes angels so special. Angels were created to serve God. When assigned a task, an angel must throw itself wholeheartedly into its mission to serve God properly, something that humans should aspire to imitate. The most common portrayal of angels originated in the late Roman Empire and is that of graceful winged beings. Popular imagination has long held fast to this kind of image, which is beautifully encapsulated in William Adolphe Bouguereau's painting The Virgin of the Angels. But these are just popular representations that do not represent angels' bodily form. According to both Jewish and Christian theology, angels are not physical beings. Jewish magazine Aish perhaps best sums up what angels are like physically, saying proper angels do not have, quote, bodies, wings, or one drop of physicality. This belief has entered Christianity as well, where angels are purely spiritual beings with no real physical form. But if angels are not physical beings, how can they appear to people as they do repeatedly in the Bible? According to Compass News, angels can take human form in order to deliver revelations or carry out God's orders. But this is all a facade because humans often require images to understand that which they cannot see. Angels are often depicted as gendered beings. A common misconception is that every boy gets a male guardian angel and every girl a female one. Angels are often depicted as female, or at least feminine. The Virgin of the Angels is an excellent example of this trend. The angels serenading Mary and Jesus appear highly feminized. Contrary to popular art, biblical angels are always described as male, perhaps because the Greek and Hebrew words for angel are both masculine. The main archangels, Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel, all have masculine names. Judges 13, meanwhile, describes an angel as, quote, a man of God. Seems pretty straightforward. Angels must be male, right? The truth, according to Jewish and Christian tradition, is that angels are neither male nor female. The distinction between male or female in Christianity is a physical question that depends upon genetics. The female-male dichotomy distinguishes the two genders through physical characteristics related to reproduction. As noted earlier, however, angels do not have bodies. Without bodies, they can't be distinguished sexually or engage in reproduction. The rules so far are fairly absolute when describing angels, but in Genesis 6 there is a passage about a group of males called the sons of nobles that seems to contradict these rules. These beings mated with the daughters of man and sired a race of giants called the Nephilim, but other Bible translations call them sons of God instead. So who were these people? According to Chabad, one Jewish tradition identifies the fathers of the Nephilim as 2 angels. This angelic pair went down to earth with God's permission, where they fell victim to their inclination for sin. This interpretation suggests that angels are capable of reproduction, in contradiction of both Jewish and Christian teachings. So how do Christians and Jews deal with this apparent contradiction? According to Catholic Answers, early Christians rejected the idea of human-angel hybrids. The sons of God were equated with mortal men. In Judaism, the question is still open, and rabbis have debated the story fiercely throughout late antiquity. The consensus rejected angel-human hybrids, but Professor Rachel Adelman notes that it may be a very old Jewish myth that the rabbis sought to suppress because of its resemblance to pagan myths from the ancient Near East. According to Faith magazine of the Diocese of Lansing, a popular saying suggests that when someone dies, heaven gains another angel. This may be of comfort to grieving relatives, but it is a myth, albeit a persistent and widespread one. The belief is based on twisting the words of one of Jesus' sayings. The source of the controversy is Mark 12:25. In this passage, Jesus discusses the afterlife and the resurrection of the dead. When the dead are resurrected, according to Christ himself, they will not marry. Christ says, they will be like the angels in heaven. What a difference one word makes. Matthew Henry's concise commentary of the Bible notes that historically this passage is interpreted to mean that in heaven, spiritually pure human souls will be like angels, but nowhere does it say that humans will become angels. Angels are popularly thought of as peaceful, benevolent beings. In English, the word angelic is used to describe something pure, holy, innocent, or beautiful. But angels can also inflict violence and vengeance on God's behalf. The Bible provides numerous instances of angels committing gruesome violence against God's enemies. This includes small-scale violence against individuals to mass killings of entire cities and nations in pursuit of God's justice. The story of Passover is an excellent example of angelic violence. When Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrews leave Egypt, God ordered the angel of death to kill the firstborn sons of Egypt. But according to the Chabad, the archangel Uriel nearly killed Moses. His wife Zipporah circumcised their son and forced Uriel to relent, saving Moses from the divine wrath. Even Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was punished for doubting God's word delivered via the archangel Gabriel. When the old man learned his wife Elizabeth was pregnant, despite her advanced age, he doubted the archangel's words. As punishment, Gabriel rendered him mute and only restored his speech faculties when he obeyed the divine order to name his son John. But despite the capacity for violence, angels that serve God are not evil or malevolent. They are simply doing their jobs and executing God's will.
You never take responsibility for anything.
There are different categories of angels. The best known yet often misunderstood are the archangels. This term does not appear in the Bible until the New Testament, but that makes sense, as it's a Greek word and the New Testament was written in Greek. However, angels and archangels do appear in the Old Testament. Although it does not use any terms to classify the archangels, they are distinguished from lesser angels in other ways. In Daniel 12:1, the archangel Michael, for instance, is referred to as, quote, the great prince, implying that he occupies a higher position relative to some other groups of angels. In the book of Tobit, the archangel Raphael reveals, I am Raphael, one of 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord. And this reference provides the earliest background for a group of angels that outranked others. The term archangel, according to Christianity Magazine, literally means chief angel and suggests that these angels are the highest-ranking angels of heaven. But in reality, they are quite low down in the angelic hierarchy. The highest-ranking angels are the seraphim, the cherubim, and the throne angels. They worship God directly and serve Him. The seraphim in particular are closest to God and burn with a fiery passion in their love for Him. Following the top 3 tiers of angels are another 3 middle-ranking groups. At the second lowest position are the archangels, who fall below the angels that watch over the principalities but above guardian angels. Despite their relatively low position in the angelic hierarchy, the archangels are still very important. Archangels and their servants below them are the only 2 groups of angels that interact directly with humans on God's behalf. They are the chief messengers in the truest sense, bearing God's instructions or executing His will on earth, making them key players to moving salvation history forward. After all, without the archangel Gabriel, there would not have been an Annunciation or a Christ. Lucifer, also known as Satan or the Devil, was once an angel himself. He's sometimes popularly thought of as an archangel, but this is not quite accurate. Lucifer was much nearer to God as a member of the seraphim, the highest-ranking angels in God's inner circle. He had the privilege of adoring God and looking upon His face. As such, Lucifer's job was to adore God with a burning passion. The book of Ezekiel described Lucifer as, quote, the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. But because of his gifts, Lucifer grew proud and jealous of God. Eventually, he decided that he was above serving God and desired God's glory for himself. He then rebelled, but was soundly defeated in the war that followed. As punishment for his rebellion, Lucifer and the other rebels were cast into hell. This is likely the source of confusion relating to Lucifer's rank. It was Saint Michael the Archangel who cast Lucifer into hell, as depicted in Giuseppe Cesari's painting. The 2 angels, however, were not equals. In the end, the lesser angel defeated the former seraphim, leaving Lucifer to reign in hell over the souls of the damned. From St. Michael's defeat of Lucifer to Gabriel's announcement of Mary's pregnancy and the impending birth of Christ, the world of the Bible depends on archangels to keep moving forward. Given their importance, one would expect Christians to agree on their identities, but they do not. Different Christian denominations recognize different archangels, drawing from both biblical and extra-biblical traditions. While Christians agree that there are 7 archangels, the Bible only names 3. According to Catholic Online, the Catholic Church only recognizes the names of Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael. The Church acknowledges the existence of the other 4, just not by name. The Eastern Orthodox Church and Anglicans recognize a 4th archangel, Uriel, who appears in non-canonical texts. The 66-book Protestant Bible omits the Book of Tobit, and since Raphael appears in Tobit, some Protestants do not recognize him by that name. While the Orthodox and Western churches limit themselves to 4 archangels, the Coptic Orthodox Church recognizes the name of all 7 archangels. The names of the 3 missing archangels are Sarathiel, Zadkiel, and Ananthiel, but these names are drawn from tradition, not the Bible. so which names are correct is not known for certain, but while the Coptic Church fully embraces traditions in this regard, the other churches are more cautious. Did Adam and Eve really eat an apple? Which religions believe their story, and just how much of their tale has been lost in translation? The whole story of Adam and Eve seems like a straightforward case, one that can't possibly get too complicated. But if you know one thing about human history, it's that we like to make things complicated. And so even Adam and Eve have been filtered through many different tales. First, there are quite a few creation myths that draw upon the basic theme seen in the Adam and Eve story. A divine force creates a small group of people, humanity somehow messes things up, and we're thereafter alienated from the divine and condemned to toil and suffer. And all too often, all of the blame gets pinned on a woman. In ancient Rome, at least according to the poet Ovid and his predecessors, it was Prometheus who created humans out of dirt and water. And Canaan, the ram-headed god of creation, was said to have formed the first people out of clay, echoing the later use of the similar terms in the Bible. And consider that the head Greek god Zeus created a woman, Pandora, to inadvertently mess up Prometheus's creation groove, to the point where the ancient poet Hesiod used her tale as an excuse to denounce all women. While it's true that the Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh doesn't show up in the book of Genesis, there are quite a few surprising parallels between his exploits and the story of Adam and Eve. First, as the University of Arizona notes, there is a parallel between the first couple of Genesis and another mentioned in the ancient epic of Gilgamesh. Namely, Enkidu begins as a wild man who eventually becomes civilized, and in turn transforms into a fast friend of Gilgamesh. A significant part of the civilizing process occurs courtesy of Shamhat, a temple-based sex worker whose relationship with Enkidu could potentially be linked to the Adam and Eve story. Her weeks-long encounter with Enkidu is intended to humanize him and further separates the wild man from his previous animal companions. Shamhat, perhaps needing a breather, offers bread and wine to Enkidu. The man takes the food and, upon consuming it, gains the knowledge he needs to become a full human. Namely, it could be argued that by consuming this human food, Enkidu begins to understand what it means to distinguish between good and evil, much like the later Adam and Eve did when they ate that fateful piece of fruit. If you were raised in a society or household where Christian belief dominated, then you could very well have assumed that Adam and Eve are central figures in the Bible only. However, their history as religious figures, as well as the story of their ill-considered stumble against God's plan for humanity, goes beyond just one religion. For one, Adam and Eve figure predominantly in Islam. The key difference, as writer Rose Hamid argues, is that God ultimately forgave the repentant pair and never bothered with original sin. And perhaps it doesn't really come as a surprise to learn that both Adam and Eve are pretty key figures in Judaism either, considering that the book of Genesis first appeared in the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, before it was rolled into the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. As My Jewish Learning reports, the very name Adam comes from the Hebrew word Adamah, which means soil, or Adom, or red, strongly implying that Adam was made out of a red soil or clay. The basic story of Adam and Eve goes like this. God created Adam from soil, breathed life into him. Adam is supposed to maintain the Garden of Eden, name the animals, and avoid fruit from one tree that grants knowledge of good and evil. Adam finds that he needs help and companionship, so God creates Eve. Things go pretty well until Eve encounters the serpent, who tells her that she should go ahead and try that forbidden fruit, even though God said that doing so would result in death. Eve tries the fruit anyway, shares it with Adam, and God casts them out of Eden. The pair are condemned to the pain and suffering of a mortal life. As the Great Courses Daily points out, the first people to read Genesis may have had a very different interpretation of the tale than a simple "don't go against God." Eve's temptation may not have been simply to snack on a tasty piece of fruit, but also to take on the mantle of God and see the world through divine eyes. Key to that may be the desire for knowledge that goes beyond good and evil to all that can be known. But as some may interpret it, that knowledge contains both great power and heavy burden, a complexity that, of course, Adam and Eve could only fully understand after their rebellion. For a moment, let's cast aside the heavy theological implications of Eve and Adam's choice to dine from the tree of knowledge. What exactly was the type of fruit they ate? If you answered apple, you're like many people who have encountered the bare bones of the story, perhaps in one of those illustrated Bible stories for kids. But are you absolutely sure that Adam and Eve were chowing down on the same sort of fruit that makes its way into pies, fritters, and kids' lunchboxes across America? Researchers certainly aren't convinced. The Bible only ever refers to the fruit in question as, well, an unidentifiable fruit. The same goes in the Hebrew version, where the similarly generic peri is used. Things only started to move in the apple direction when Jerome, a 4th century scholar who translated works for the Pope, used the Latin word malus, which can sometimes be interpreted as apple or even other types of fruit. John Milton, the writer of the epic 17th century English poem Paradise Lost, also used the word apple in reference to Adam and Eve, though readers at the time likely thought of apple as yet another catch-all word for nearly any kind of fruit. It's only later that readers interpreted the poem and other relevant sources more literally, and the whole apple in the garden image really got started. While it's true that there are some literalists out there who believe the story of Adam and Eve happened just as it's described in Genesis, not everyone agrees. Even religious folks don't always take it at face value. Consider that, as Gallup reports, the number of Americans who believe in creationism is falling, and even evangelical Christians, who you may believe to more likely hold to these sorts of religious conservative views, don't necessarily fall into the literalist category. As NPR reports, there is a small but significant number of evangelicals who doubt the hard and fast truth of the Adam and Eve story. There is genetic evidence, for one, which shows that our human genome is far too diverse to have arisen from just 2 people. And mutations don't explain that either, unless our species went through an intense round of genetic mutation rates that has since quieted down considerably. That's not to say that this is an easy pill for believers to swallow. Interpreting the story of Adam and Eve metaphorically while acknowledging the possibility that the infamous duo and their paradise may never have actually existed is a step too far for some. For them, believing in anything other than the literal truth of Adam and Eve drastically undermines their faith. Many religious scholars have actually mined 2 different stories out of Genesis. According to Bible Odyssey, there are 2 different ways in which God seems to have created the world and humanity in the text. While some people fold the 2 together, there are some significant inconsistencies. Genesis 1, for instance, said that animals were created first, while in the very next chapter it seems like humans were the first living creatures to debut. The chapters also refer to God with different names and each have a unique style, leading some to conclude that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were written by 2 different authors. Things get even more complicated when you zoom in on the first human couple. And no, according to some faith traditions, it wasn't necessarily Adam and Eve who were the first of our species. That's because Genesis 1:27 references the creation of a human couple, but Eve doesn't make her appearance until Genesis 2:22. Jewish folklore maintains that this actually points to the existence of a first wife, Lilith. As the story goes, Lilith realized that she was created out of the same earth as Adam, and so didn't want to submit to him. Things went south from there, to the point where she fled Eden, turned into a demon, and God decided to start over with the more pliant Eve. Part of the problem of Lilith, as the Biblical Archaeology Society explains, is that she was created from the same material, soil, and at the same time as Adam. To solve said problem on the second try, God is said to have created Eve from Adam's own body, marking her out as a subservient helpmate who was formed from a smaller, lesser portion of Adam. Traditionally, that body part was said to be a portion of Adam's rib, but can we be totally sure that modern English translations of Genesis have gotten it right? Not really, according to some biblical scholars. The original Hebrew word in question is selah. That's been traditionally translated as rib for centuries, but a more recent analysis suggests that it's a very different bone. Basically, the word may mean any number of bones that could be in the hands or feet for one. Or it could be a reference to the baculum, otherwise known as the penis bone. Given that humans are one of the few mammal species to lack a baculum, some researchers have wondered if the text could be referring to that particular part of the skeletal anatomy, now missing in modern humans. Of course, that could be the result of evolution, but the notion has remained an interesting side note in biblical studies for a while now. What of the devious creature that somehow gained access to the Garden of Eden in order to lead both Adam and Eve astray? How did the devil come to such a central role in the first story of humanity? Hold on. Satan wasn't part of early Jewish theology. The earliest interpretations of Genesis didn't assume that there was some very powerful archfiend out to subvert God's plan. Eventually, however, changes in how Jewish people lived and read their own scripture made way for a satanic figure, meaning that many began to reinterpret the serpent of Genesis as none other than the devil himself, even though there's no textual evidence in the scripture to support this. In Islam, however, the connection is more explicit. In the Quran, says Britannica, Allah created Adam out of clay and commanded the angels to worship the new creation. Iblis took exception to this and offered up the tempting fruit to knock humanity down a peg or two. The fall and expulsion from Eden proceeded more or less the same as in the Jewish and Christian versions, with a significant exception. Allah offers to forgive the human pair if they promise to follow him and not Iblis. Thus, in Muslim belief at least, Satan really is the serpent in the Garden of Eden. This one surely seems pretty straightforward. After all, you can point straight to Genesis 3:16, which elaborates on God's punishment for Eve. He tells her, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children." The issue, once again, lies in the many translations of the Tanakh, Bible, Quran, and other religious texts over the centuries. Archaic Hebrew, you see, does not perfectly translate to English, Arabic, or really any other modern language. Here, the issue is the word for pain. According to Answering Islam, that original Hebrew word etziv can also refer to toil or labor, as in Adam's toil over the earth to bring forth sustenance. That same word could also mean emotional pain, as in sadness, so it's not perfectly clear that the original text meant the oftentimes intense physical pain of bearing children. Yet, that's been the prevalent interpretation of the verse for a very long time, to the point where modern women were made to endure labor and delivery without much, if any, pain relief, says the Journal of Anesthesia History. For many, it was the natural result of Eve's sin, passed down to her female descendants as a form of supposedly deserved suffering.